Hi, I'm Kayvon Tarani, your Global Compassion Pastor.
And I'm AB, your local Compassion Director.
And we're here to welcome all of you to Compassion Immersion 2016. Compassion Immersion is our time in August to slow down and celebrate what God has done over the last 12 months because of your time and because of your giving. We've seen God do a lot of things and impact thousands of lives globally and locally. AB is here to share a little bit about some of the projects that we've been able to do both here in the Bay Area, and I'll share a little bit about what we do globally around the world.
I know all of us are fairly familiar with Beautiful Day, but Local Compassion also has other ministries that give back to our immediate community, such as School Impact. We basically serve under-resourced students and love on teachers within the Moreland School District, and we also teach English as a second language on our South Hill campus every Monday, September through May, from beginners to intermediate to advanced. So thank you everyone for your devotion, your sacrifice, your prayers. I am so grateful, and God has blessed us mightily because of you.
Also globally, we're thankful for the gifts that you gave, that we were able to support 38 global missionaries and local missionaries that impact lives all in different ways, through students, through schools, through hospitals, through outreach and evangelism, and through education. Their stories are written actually right here in this booklet that you have, that we put together for you. The Compassion Immersion 2016 booklet has some of the people that we support, the projects that we support, and the amount that you guys gave that is truly impacting our world. Not only that, we impact people through water, through Westgate Water, through the Advent Conspiracy Funds and your recycling. And we're so thankful that as a church we're able to impact so many different areas of the world. Now, how can you get involved? There's also a loud card in your worship folder that you can pull out. You can pledge what you would like to give over the next 12 months or even a one-time gift. Every little bit makes a difference, and together as a church, when you put everything together as Westgate Church, we see a large amount that we're able to give, and we're so thankful for that. So thank you again for your faithfulness in coming and in giving and in serving, along with AB and our local compassion department. We're just super thankful.
Thank you so much, Westgate Church.
Oh my gosh. Okay. This is the time of year, as you heard from Kayvon saying, that we're in Compassion Immersion. And this is an opportunity for us to kind of review what's been happening in the past 12 months. But I love to set it in the context of what's been going on really globally for a couple of hundred years. For about 223 years, to be exact, a movement started, the most significant movement by far in the last 200 years. It wasn't whatever you think the most significant thing was in the last 200 years, man landing on the moon or your birthday or whatever you think it is. By far the most significant movement that's happened for global emphasis in the last 220 years, maybe ever, is the modern missionary movement, which was started by a guy named William Carey in 1793 when he went to India. And what happened was his example and some other factors it kind of birthed in the church, mostly in Europe, to go and share the gospel of Christ all over the world. And so what they did over the next 50, 75 years is that they went to every major continent in the world, and basically went to the coastlines. And so after that, what happened was then the China Inland Mission with a guy named Hudson Taylor, William Carey, Hudson Taylor, big names. Remember these? Hudson Taylor said, we got to go inland. And at the time of, for our context, the end of our Civil War, 1865, they started an inland movement where they went inland into China, inland into India, inland into South America and Africa and those continents, and began to share the gospel there. It had not penetrated those continents before. And so in 1865, that's what happened. Around 1930, 1934, we have another shift by a guy named Cameron Townsend with Wycliffe Bible translators. And what he said was, you can go into a country, but inside of that country, there are like hundreds and hundreds of different people groups which speak different languages. And so just because you have a Bible in Mandarin doesn't mean that you've got it in all the dialects in China. And so the movement then began with an emphasis towards people groups. And we are still in this movement now. There are people groups on our planet that do not have the scriptures translated in their language. And so we are still in the process of the Christian faith is still in the process of identifying those people groups, raising up and training people who can translate the Bible into their own personal vernacular and then getting it to them. And we find ourselves in that context now. Now, in 2010, what I thought was, along with this, I would start introducing you in Compassion Immersion to different heroes of the faith, people who have come before us that we are particularly ignorant about. Now, please don't be offended, but we just don't know a lot about these guys. They're not taught in the public schools or even in the private schools primarily. These are folks that had great impact. God had used them greatly, but inside of this context of the missions movement of taking the message of Christ to the rest of the world. So I introduced you to John Patton. In 2010, he was the dude who went to a bunch of islands where there were cannibals, and the guy said, "John, you can't go there, they'll eat you." And he said, "Well, when you die, the worms are going to eat you, so what's the difference?" This was a great guy. John Patton was a great guy. David Brainerd was next, and he was the guy that from all standards of the world died a failure, but the biography that was written about him after he had died became just a gigantic instrument in the hands of God to help birth the modern missionary movement. After him was Adoniram Judson. Andrew Fuller. Andrew Fuller was next. He was the guy who stayed at home so that William Carey could go to India, the first guy I told you about. He was the guy who stayed at home and raised money for him so he could go. So he introduced the phrase, the rope holder. He said, "You climb down the rope and I'll hold the rope for you. I'll stay at home and hold the rope." And so I introduced you to him. Then Adoniram Judson. Adoniram Judson's first Protestant missionary from the North American continent. Then there was John Newton. John Newton's famous pastor, famous hymn writer. He wrote the hymn Amazing Grace. He actually comes into the story that I'm going to share with you today. And then George Mueller last year. I introduced you to George, who's probably the weirdest looking one of the bunch. And George and his congregation started a movement that ended up bringing relief to orphans, hundreds of thousands of orphans. Just him and his congregation started it, and then they just saw God do incredible things. Today, I want to introduce you to one of my all-time favorite heroes, and that is William Wilberforce. Now, some of you will be a little bit more familiar with him than any of these other guys because there was a movie about 5 or 6 years ago that came out called Amazing Grace, and it was a biographical treatment of William Wilberforce, but probably most of us still, hopefully I'll share some things with you today that you didn't know, and he'll be an encouragement to us. William Wilberforce, I wrote this down about his life and what I hope that we can learn from it. It is constant, regular exertions for the causes of good. This little dude, he was barely 5'1", he barely weighed 100 pounds. Which was small. He was the smallest. Anyway, he was a little tiny dude. It makes me feel big, and I'm little. This guy, with constant, regular exertions for causes of good, God used him in amazing ways, and he can do the same thing through you and I. So let me pray for us. We'll jump right in. God, thanks for the people who have come before us, not only these great historical figures, but just the people who are part of this church that 20 years ago had a dream for what this place might be, and 50 years ago even started birthing it and where we are now because of their faith. And God, I ask that our time together as we look at William Wilberforce, that he would stir in us the courage to kind of be the kind of champion that he was. We'll need your help to do that. Please use this time for our good and your glory. In Jesus' name, amen. I've been waiting a long time to do William Wilberforce, but because of all the racial strife in our country this summer, I thought that this would be the good year to do it. Let me tell you a little bit about William Wilberforce as he grew up. He grew up in a very rich family, very, very wealthy, but his father died when he was very young. As you know from your time in watching Downton Abbey, that back in the British culture, rich folks didn't raise their children. They sent them off to school. They sent them off to boarding school and those kinds of things. And that's what happened to William Wilberforce. He was sent off, but at first he was sent off to an aunt. His mom sent him off to this aunt, and the aunt ended up being a Christian. And she exposed him to Christianity. She kind of planted some seeds. But then the mother found out that the aunt was a Christian and was horrified that her son was getting exposed to that, yanked him away from the aunt, put him in a boarding school, and eventually he ends up in Cambridge. He's a party animal. He's a rich, spoiled kid that parties all the time, doesn't apply himself at school, and does nothing, to his own admission, does nothing doesn't distinguish himself in any way, except for he makes one really good friend. And that one really good friend's name is William Pitt. When they graduate from Cambridge, they're both 21 years old, him and William Pitt, and they decide on a joke that they'll run for Parliament. They both have lots of money. They spend lots of their own money in a campaign, and both of them win. So here's William Pitt and this goof-off, William Wilberforce, and they're now members of the Parliament. In fact, 4 years later, at 25, William Pitt will become the youngest prime minister of history in Great Britain. Well, the life of a parliamentarian is you go and you're in session for about a month or 2 months, and then you go off for 3 or 4, and then you come back for a month or 2, and then you go off for 3 or 4. And he was going off on these breaks. And he would go to very nice places. He would go to these vacation places there in Europe, and he would just basically just lounge around and party. He says, I was just a sloth. He says, I just wasted money and time. And then at one point, he invites a guy named Isaac Milner, who was an elementary school friend who had become a tutor and an instructor and was very well read and very well educated. And he invited him to go to one of these vacation spots with him. And on the way, he finds out that Milner's a Christian. Milner breaks all the stereotypes. He thinks that Christians are just like super emotional, don't think through things. He's got these stereotypical kind of picture of what they are like. And so Milner says while they're at this place, he says, why don't we work our way, read a book in the evening time? This is, we do Facebook and stuff. They read books to each other. So, they said, and there was a book there that they grab, and it was called The Rise and Progress of Religion in the Soul by Philip Doddridge. They read it while they're there. They read it on the trip home, and not right away, but through a process of different things, William Wilberforce becomes a Christian. Now, he knows of a pastor in London named John Newton. And so he says, I'm going to go and talk to John Newton. If you were familiar with the movie, he was afraid that somebody would see him going in because he's a member of Parliament and he's going in to see this flaming Christian who writes songs about Jesus and all this stuff. But he finally goes in and sees him, and he says to him, Pastor Newton, I don't know what he called him, Johnny, I've become a Christian. I'm wasting my life. I think I'm supposed to become a pastor. And Newton, bless his heart, Newton said to him, for God's sake, don't become a pastor. Now, let me tell you what he really said. He said something. He said, it is hoped and believed that God has raised you up for the good of his church and for the good of the nation. Stay in Parliament. And so he goes back and he says, okay, I don't really know what to do. He gets away and he asks God, what do you think you have of me? And in 1787, he writes in his journal, God has set before me two great objects, the suppression of the slave trade and the reformation of morals. He says that I am in Parliament to suppress and stop the slave trade in our country, and then he said to improve the morals of the country. Now you have to understand, in 1787, Great Britain is the most powerful navy in the world. And it's the colonialism of the day. They are moving out and they are grabbing chunks of the New World and establishing them and putting industry there. And most of it's being done through slavery. Great Britain alone, not counting Portugal or Spain or France, any of those other people, Great Britain alone is transporting 100,000 slaves a year. And there is not a single person in England that believes that they can exist as a country economically without slavery. And William Wilberforce has something happen. He has some friends that take him and show him the horrors of this. They take him to a slave boat, and he sees something like this on a slave boat. It's about to pop up. The conditions on the slave boats in 1787, show the next one. It kind of shows a layout of the way the captains would fit the people in. There's another picture right after this one. 1787, if you transported slaves and you arrived with half of them surviving, that was considered a good job. The horrors of the slave trade. And he just stands up in 1787. He goes before the Parliament and he serves notice and he says, no country that claims to believe in God can ever treat human beings this way. And he introduces a bill for the abolition of slavery, of slave trade. And of course, it is shot down immediately. And that began a 20-year battle where he would go away, and every time the Parliament would meet, he would introduce another bill, they would defeat it, he would go away, he would study, he would gain support, he would come and present these kinds of arguments, and people hated him. They ridiculed him. They told him it was ridiculous. Now, here's a cool story. You've seen the movie, most of you have probably seen the movie The Patriot with Mel Gibson. Yeah. Hello. I mean, you've seen it? Okay, enough of you have seen it, so I've seen it. I can't watch it anymore just because of personal things, but it's a great movie. There's a villain in the movie. Colonel William Tavington is his name in the movie. He's the guy who ends up killing Mel Gibson's son at the end. You guys help me out. You get this? Give me a nod, something. This means yes, this means no. You've seen it? Back in the back, you know what I'm talking about? Okay, good. Well, that guy was based on a real character whose name was Sir Bannister Tarleton, who actually did fight in the war with the United States. And now, in William Wilberforce's time, he's now a member of Parliament. And Tarleton is said to be the man in England who has killed more men than anyone else. And apparently the way when a guy stood up and started introducing a bill, Tarleton's had enough of this dude, of William Wilberforce. Now remember, William Wilberforce is the smallest dude in Parliament. He's barely 5 foot. I mean, he's 5'1" and 100 and nothing. I mean, he's an itty-bitty tiny guy. And apparently that if you disagreed with what was going on and being talked about in Parliament, you could rustle your papers and do something with a pen, and it pretty much said, I don't like what you're saying, and I'm going to challenge you to a duel. I read it in one of the biographies. I don't really know what all was doing. But apparently, Tarleton begins to do this as Wilberforce, trying to intimidate him to make him sit down. And everybody in the room knows if they duel, Tarleton's going to kill Wilberforce. He ain't got a chance. Wilberforce didn't partake in any duels ever. He's the smallest guy in Parliament. So you can imagine the pressure. They're thinking, okay, Wilberforce is dead. William Pitt is the prime minister at the time, and he takes and turns his chair toward Tarleton, who's rustling his papers, and he begins to rustle his papers towards him. And he basically says, you mess with him, you mess with me. I'm the most powerful man in the room. And Tarleton put his papers down. Finally, in 1807, 20 years after Wilberforce began to fight for the end of slave trade, in 1807, he introduced a bill to the House. Yes, for the vote. 283. No, 16. And at that moment, he said, now we go after slavery as an institution. We've stopped the trade of slaves, the selling of human beings. Now we stop slavery everywhere in our country, all of the colonies everywhere. Well, it was one thing to stop the trade. It was just, no one believed he could do this. And he started another fight that lasted another 20 years. Another 20 years. Let me tell you a little bit about his home life. This guy is amazing. He's very unique and very distinct. Remember, Downton Abbey is kind of how homes are run. And Wilberforce has been single his whole life. He never married. He didn't want to marry. He liked being single. He was a confirmed bachelor. And then at the age of 37, he met a 20-year-old woman named Barbara. They dated 8 days. And then they got engaged. And then 6 days later got married. And then over the next 9 years, they had 6 children, making up for lost time. And the pictures that you hear and read of in these biographies of Wilberforce when he was at home, remember the context of all I'm about to tell you at home is at work, he's introducing bill after bill after bill after bill, and people are saying, you're an idiot, you're stupid, we will never do this, get out of here. He has cartoon caricatures drawn of him in the papers. He's ridiculed in every single way, that he is said to be an enemy of Britain. And in that context of a hard work, hard life at work, he would come home, and a friend of the family, a woman named Miss Sullivan, said this: by the tones of his voice and the expression of his countenance, he showed that joy was the prevailing feature of his own mind. Joy springing from an entireness of trust in the Savior's merit and from love to God and man. A dude named Robert Southey said this: I never saw any other man who seemed to enjoy such perpetual serenity and sunshine of spirit. In conversing with him, you feel assured that there is no guile in him. If ever there was a good and happy man on earth, he was one. Another person whose father used to come and speak with William about the things that were going on, and she used to play with the friends. She said this: Wilberforce would interrupt his serious talks with my father and come out and romp with us in the lawn. His love for and enjoyment of all children was remarkable. One story talks about how they were having this big game and kicking things around, and he went and tried to kick a bowling ball with the kids, and he broke his toe. Robert Southey also said this. He says, the pell-mell, topsy-turvy, chaotic confusion of the Wilberforce apartment, in which Barbara sat like Patience on a monument, while her husband frisks about as if every vein in his body were filled with quicksilver. I mean, this little bitty dude who's about as big as the kids just loved playing with kids, got down, never shipped his kids off to go to school somewhere else, kept them in the home. One time he met with the Duke of Wellington. That's a big dude. And by this time now, William Wilberforce is a big deal. And he met with the Duke of Wellington, and the Duke of Wellington said this: you have made me so entirely forget that you are a great man by seeming to forget it yourself during all our talks. This is my favorite quote about William Wilberforce. It says this. Listen carefully. Being himself amused and interested by everything, whatever he said became amusing and interesting. His presence was as fatal to dullness as to immorality, and his mirth was as irresistible as the first laughter of childhood. Don't you wish we still wrote like that? Let me read it to you again. Being himself amused and interested by everything, whatever he said became amusing and interesting. Now watch this. His presence was as fatal to dullness as it was to immorality. Now we know people who are, when they show up, they get rid of dullness. They're the life of the party. They're always telling jokes. They're fun to be around. And we know people who, when you're around them, they stop immorality. No dirty jokes around those people. But somebody who can do both, well, for the next 20 years, now 20 years after the first 20 years, the second 40, in truth, he ended up spending almost 50 years in Parliament. And he's fighting slavery. He's fighting this institution of slavery. And towards the end, he met with John Wesley, another famous pastor of the time. And John Wesley said this, "Unless God has raised you up for this very thing, you will be worn out by the opposition of man and devils. But if God goes before you, who can be against you?" No matter how much they slandered him, no matter how much criticism he had, and some of it was actually brutal. Folks that were really good with words, that didn't have to tell the truth as long as it sounded plausible. Does that sound familiar in politics? It was alive and well in the early 1800s. On July 26th, 1833, Wilberforce heard, by then he's so ill that he can't be in Parliament anymore. But in 1833, Wilberforce hears of the government concessions that guaranteed the passing of the bill for the abolition of slavery. He hears it on July 26th. The next day, he goes into a coma. And 2 days after that, he dies. William J., a pastor that was a part of his memorial service, said that William Wilberforce said this about him, said that his disinterested self-denial, his laborious declining efforts in the cause of justice and humanity will call down blessings of millions, and ages yet to come will glory in his memory. 800,000 slaves were set free in 1833. All because one man stood in the face of all of the racial prejudice and opposition, and God raised up around him an army of men that turned the tide for one country. It's my opinion, and this is just my opinion, that he is the greatest advocate for racial equality that has ever lived. Now, I know some of y'all might say Martin Luther King Jr. or Abraham Lincoln. That's okay, whatever you want. Remember, this is 1833, way before anybody else is doing this. And he changes the whole nation because of 40 years of laborious, just staying at it. Just staying at it. And then he did it. He did it with such joy. There's a story about when they when they stopped the slave trade, that afterwards there was a little party at a bar, and so they were at the bar, and everybody's toasting. William Wilberforce turns to a friend and he says, "What should we abolish next?" I mean, the guys just stayed after it. You know, you've heard me say this a lot before. A big old oak tree is just a little nut that hung around a long time. Two things from his life for us. First, at a time where the racial divisions in our country are as intense as they have been in many, many years. It is time for you and I to make a stand. Colossians chapter 3, verse 11. Says here, there is no Greek or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free. And if you take a sister passage, which in Galatians 3, which includes male and female, what the gospel of Christ does is tears down racial, national, religious, cultural, social, and divisions by sex. There is, according to the teachings of Christ and the teachings of the New Testament, no place in the community of Christ followers and in your individual heart for any divisions based on any of those reasons. There is no justification. There is no way you can rationalize this. There is no way you can bend the scriptures to teach something different. At a time when people are championing that these lives matter and these lives matter, the scriptures have been hollering for 2,000 years, all lives matter. And if you feel differently, you violate the teachings of Christ, you violate the Christian faith, and you violate the traditions of the heroes of the shoulders that we stand on today. There is no room. Let me say this as clearly as I can. There is no room in the teachings of the scriptures for the prejudices that we see in our culture. And the community of Christ's people, the church, must rise up and stand against it. Everywhere we see it, everywhere it's joked about, everywhere it's uncomfortable, we have to stand against it. We have to. How do we do that? Well, the passage goes on to say, put on these things. Put on compassion, which is a sensitivity to those who are suffering. Put on kindness, which manifests itself in a sweet disposition and thoughtful interpersonal dealings. Put on humility, which means having a realistic view of who you are, not elevated too greatly. Put on gentleness, which means not behaving harshly, arrogantly, or self-assertively. Put on patience, which is the quality of having long suffering, self-restraining. Put on forbearance, which means putting up with others when they're a pain in your butt. No, it's not what Webster says, but you get it. Put on forgiveness that involves never holding a grudge and releasing the debt that you believe people owe you. And over all those things, put on love, which is desiring the very best for someone else. If you say you love someone, then you will their best. We allow Christ and the peace of Christ to rule and the word of Christ to dwell. The peace of Christ to rule and the word of Christ to dwell. This must be our hallmark. This has to be. You have to help us. We are only as good in the area of standing against injustices in our country and in our city as the worst person in the room at it. You have to help us. So that's the first thing. The first thing that William Wilberforce teaches us is that regardless of the odds, regardless of the popularity, we will and we must stand for the rights of the disenfranchised, the prejudiced against, those people that are in our community that don't get a fair hearing. But there's a second thing. And the second thing is just the willingness to stay at it for a long period of time in the same direction. It's just amazing what this little dude accomplished. Because in 1787, he said, God has set before me two things. Slavery and morals. By the way, if you want to know if he was effective in the second one, all of the things that you think about the prudish English way, that was all post-Wilberforce. As there was gigantic revivals of the Christian movement because of some of the foundational work that he did. He didn't just champion injustices that were based on race. He was right in the middle of child labor laws and the chimney sweeps and helping them. He had such a soft heart and compassion that they said his house was always full of all these different kinds of animals, because on his walk home from Parliament, he would always find some stray. He introduced and championed and began animal rights and protection agencies for animals even in his country. This guy, everything about him just poured out this goodness of what Christ had accomplished. And he decided, I'm going to stay after this for a long period of time in one direction. So with the remainder of our time, I'm going to have to hurry a little bit, but let me show you. This is what we do every year. So if you're here and you're not really a part of Westgate, great time to come, because you see you'll get to see a major part of who we are and what we do with our resources here. And then if you are here, this is your place of worship, then you've got, this is what we've been doing, and it should be an encouragement to you to join in if you're not already in on this. Why? Well, I'm just going to skip that and go to a William Wilberforce quote. He said this: "No man has the right to be idle. There is so much misery to alleviate." No person in the room has the right to be idle, and I would say also has the right, if you claim allegiance to Christ, that has the right to just take all your funds and spend them only on you. Now, if you think I'm trying to get in your wallet, spend them somewhere else. But there is so much pain and so much suffering and so much misery to alleviate in the world that you cannot sit in this very comfortable room and just think, well, things are okay, I guess. You have to pay attention to what's happening in the world. The amount of suffering going on right now by millions and millions of people means that we have to move outside of our context and bear the weight and the responsibility of our world. Are you with me? So that being true, what does that look like? Let me show you what we've done and walk you through why we do what we do and what we've done. This is taking you back to 2001. This shows you our general budget, shows you how much money we gave away and the percentage of that budget for that year. It's full disclosure, I don't have any other numbers. There are no numbers other than these. And you can see that in the first 5 years, we had a dream. A dream was birthed in us that we could one day maybe give away a large percentage of the money that came in. But it seemed like if we made some progress, we couldn't seem to get into double digits in terms of percentage of money given away. In 04, 05, we thought, oh man, we just hit six-digit numbers given away, $100,000 in a year. That was amazing to us. We were just blown away, and we saw it tick up to 8%. And then the very next year, it went down again to 6%. And we thought, well, maybe the dream, maybe it can't happen. We're just going to keep tracking and pushing along and seeing what happens. So the next 5 years rolled along, and we started to see incredible progress. And by the way, these 5 years are happening while we're paying off the buildings we've built. So that's double, like, what? How did this begin to happen? But God started to move in us, and a generosity started to happen in that we saw the numbers go up. And in a 5-year period, the number of dollars given outside of our walls in this 5-year period more than doubled. And the percentages went up into the 20%. And we were like, oh my gosh, this is fantastic. This is just, we can't believe that God, at this point, I started to feel really guilty because I had been telling people this vision and felt like God had challenged me with it. But the truth is, I didn't really believe it. I didn't know that it could be done. I didn't know anybody else that did it. Let me put it in the context of other churches. The average church in America gives away less than 2% of their money. And then the last 5 years happened. No credit to anybody in the room and no credit to me. If you think there was this plan, this great leadership that led us to this, that is the farthest thing from the truth. The whole time I doubted we could make it. And we haven't made it, but we could get to these kinds of numbers. I remember in 2003, before we built this building, someone saying, don't build a building, just raise the money and give it away. And I said, wait, if you take a longer view at this thing, maybe there might be a day, maybe I'll never see it, but there might be a day when we could give $1 million away every year. And then in 2013, 2014, that was an incredible year. We jumped up over 2 million. We hit 51%, which is our goal. Our goal is to give away 50%, a number equaling 50% of our general budget. This year was amazing. And then we were blessed with new family members and new responsibilities as in 2014-15, that's when South Hills campus came to us. By the way, here's the very simple way for you to know. The previous year's actual budget becomes the following year's proposed budget. That should make sense to everybody here. Whatever you gave last year, in other words, this year's about to end in August. At the end of August, our fiscal year ends. Whatever that year, we're guessing it's around 5.8. Whatever that number is that you gave, that will be next year's budget. There's no scheming special room with a phone straight to the throne of God has some kind of intake, and how much do you think people are going to give? We don't know, so we're going by what you gave last year. And every year for a long time, this is probably going to be the first year that it stays flat. Every year previously, it's gone up. But we've seen, we took on, not only was 2013, 2014 such a great budget year that it bumped that number up, but we also inherited a budget of over $1 million from South Hills. And so the number jumped down, and then it jumped down again because of all the expenses of South Hills and then the new campus in Sunnyvale. And so we're doing our very best. My week last week was filled with meetings of evaluating the number of staff and how we're doing things so that we can try to trim and do the best job we can at stewarding this number. So that we can, and it's not just money. I hope you know that I'm not saying that. But if you want to know what's important to you and me, all you got to do is look at our wallets. Put your money where your mouth is, where your dollars go, that's what's important. Now, here's another way to look at it. Because I was motivated by that 2003 conversation that person said, just give that $2 million away, because you'll never give that much away anyway. Just raise that money and give it away. So I said, I wonder since 2001 how much money has been given and how much we've given away. So I did kind of a dirty math on the general budget line item, and over 15 years, it was $40 million given. And then, this wasn't dirty math, I actually added this column. The giving outside of our walls was $11,278,412, or over 25% of the money given over that 15-year period. We will continue, by God's grace and your generosity, we will continue to push and stretch, because no man has the right to be idle when there is so much suffering to alleviate. And I would say no community of people has the right to turn inward and put all their resources on themselves when there is so much suffering in our world. This is why we do Compassion Immersion, to remind you and I that we have a responsibility outside of this parking lot to our city and to our world. Here's another good thing. The Westgate Water, which started with just a few people's dreams of how this happened. Could you bring up that slide? This is just this year. 47 wells in 16 countries this year. 23,500 people given access to clean water 24/7, 365 days a year. And mostly it was paid for by your trash. But that is just amazing to me. At this rate, things are going to go crazy. We need, by the way, Westgate Water needs your help, because as you bring now that trash in, it's got to be crunched. and then tote it off, I think that we've got room for some help if you would like to help. So please help us do that. At this rate, we've already now dug over 200 wells, and it's just going to go crazy. Who knows what that number could be in the future. Let the peace of Christ rule. And let the word of Christ dwell. The resource behind being this kind of people is a dependency of relationship with Jesus Christ that allows His peace to rule our hearts. And a dependency and a knowledge of the teachings of Christ that are very accurate and very relevant into our day of how we are to live. Let the word of Christ dwell. No peoples, no one sitting here has the right to be idle. There is so much suffering to alleviate. By God's grace, I wonder what the next 5 years will be. What areas, what dreams, what responses of justice and mercy and kindness might the next 5 years bring if we just determine to stay faithful in one direction for a long time. Let's pray. Father, if anything was said in any way that pulled the glory away from you, we confess that now and admit that not a dime could have been moved and collected and done without your help. We do not set ourselves up as some super church, elevating ourselves above others. We trust that you're going to guide those communities in ways that you want them to move. But God, you have shown us what faithfulness looks like, and I pray you would find us faithful. I thank you for the faithfulness of the folks that have gone before, the amazing generosity of people that have given of their time and their efforts and their talents and their treasures as well. And God, I pray that you would find us willing to step into the gap, no matter how uncomfortable, in the middle of racial tension, economic tension, social tension, that we would be agents of peace, that we would loudly proclaim that all lives matter. And because that is true, you will find us generous. We commit ourselves to that purpose, that direction, knowing that unless you sustain us, we will fall. Please help us stay faithful. In the name of Christ, amen.